No, we don't have a sense at the moment. My feeling, or the hints that have been dropped, is that this is a pretty broad offer that the government's made, a pretty broad and sweeping one to provide whatever help really is necessary to help Solomon Islands hold the elections next year as planned. Now, just a bit of background here. The elections have been set down for 2023, but Manasseh Sogavare, the Prime Minister, has moved this bill in Parliament to essentially push them back by almost a year or so because of the Pacific Games, which are also going to be held in 2023 in Honiara. His argument is that Solomon Islands simply doesn't have the resources or the capacity to hold two such big events in the same year. Now, the opposition said a few weeks ago that Australia should intervene and offer to essentially stump up the cash to hold them as scheduled. They argue that any move to push back the elections would be profoundly anti-democratic. Now, Australia's very keen not to pitch this as a response to that call from the opposition. They're aware of the domestic sensitivities here, and they don't want to be accused of meddling in domestic politics in Solomon Islands. But by making this offer, albeit quite late, it's saying to Solomon Islands and the government, look, if the real problem is cash, or if the real problem is capacity, then we stand by to help. And if that's useful, then we can help you hold the elections as scheduled for 2023, rather than pushing it back to 2024.
Stephen, do you think it's likely that Manasseh Sogavare will take up the offer, or does he seem set on his current course?
Well, I think he's going to be very much set on his current course. In fact, not long ago, Yvonne, the government of Solomon Islands put out a press release essentially saying that the offer the Australian government had put out was inappropriate, saying that the timing of the election was not one for the Australian government to determine, but was instead one for the people and Parliament of Solomon Islands to determine. So that seems to provide an answer. If the government does want to offer this money contingent on the Solomon Islands holding elections in the normal process, Manasseh Sogavare is not interested. And there is in this press release, you'd have to say, a somewhat resentful tone, similar to the one that the Prime Minister has adopted towards Australia earlier in the year when the Morrison government raised such concerns about its security pact with China, a sense that Australia shouldn't try to dictate to the Solomon Islands. So although it's just an initial sort of response, I think we can take from that Manasseh Sogavare remains absolutely set on his current course, which is ploughing ahead with an election in 2024 rather than 2023. That puts him on a collision course with the opposition, which is continuing to argue that the entire process that the Prime Minister's put forward is profoundly anti-democratic and will probably solidify concerns in other places, including Australia, New Zealand, and also the United States, that the trajectory of Solomon Islands is one that is not favourable to Australia and the West, and that Mr Sogavare remains increasingly sceptical and at times even hostile to traditional partners like Australia and New Zealand. Certainly there's no sign of this being resolved anytime soon. The thing to watch now is whether Mr Sogavare's path that he's put the country on, whether that results in any unrest or civil disturbance on the street. That's something the opposition has warned may well happen. It's not clear that it necessarily will, but if it does, then again, that will potentially present some really difficult and invidious choices to Australia, which retains a security force in Solomon Islands, as well as to other countries in the region.
And this offer of funding comes after Solomon Islands announced a ban on foreign Navy vessels entering Honiara. Does this ban apply to Australia?
No, it doesn't, although we only learnt that yesterday. There was a real flurry when this news broke, when the United States essentially revealed that one of its Coast Guard ships, a cutter, had been turned back by Solomon Islands. That then led to headlines saying that Solomon Islands had banned all naval ships from foreign countries from visiting its country or from visiting its waters and from docking at Honiara or any of its ports, and caused a real stir, particularly in Washington, where it was taken as proof that Solomon Islands was increasingly isolated, and perhaps evidence that it was again turning more towards China than towards its traditional partners in Australia and New Zealand. But yesterday, Manasseh Sogavare provided a bit more clarity. He said that Australia, New Zealand and Fiji, which have existing essentially treaties or security treaties with Solomon Islands, were exempt from that moratorium on naval vessels because there was already a procedure in place. It was only other countries, he said, who were covered. And he also said that he hoped hoped that this moratorium wouldn't last long, that they'd have draft new guidelines for naval visits crafted by the end of next week, and then hopefully introduced not that long after that. So the fact that Australia and New Zealand and Fiji are exempt from this will be a source of some relief here in Canberra, and it probably does dull, at least to some extent, the argument that this was really aimed against the West. It seems like at least Australia and New Zealand here are protected here or are exempt, but I don't think it will necessarily calm fears about the trajectory of Solomon Islands, particularly in Washington, where there does seem to be a great deal of anxiety about the way that things are trending, and a feeling that China has gained the upper hand. Mr. Sogavare, for his part, says that the entire issue has been overblown, and has reiterated that Solomon Islands is going to maintain a friends to all, enemies to none approach. He rejects any argument that he's hewing closer to Beijing. But all of these things that we've seen over the last few months, the increased cooperation between Chinese police, Solomon Islands police, debates about media freedom and democratic decay in Solomon Islands, an increasingly hostile tone towards the media and sometimes towards the West from Mr. Sogavare, all of this is stirring a great deal of unease in Western capitals.
Stephen Dziedzic, thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne.